All right, and welcome to our next project, Jobster API. And first, let me give you a short backstory, just so we all are on the same page. If you remember the previous project, I used a React application to show how some features work on a front end. And eventually, I did create a proper project in my React course, which was based on the Jobs API. Now, while I was building the project, I decided to add some more features, just so it's more interesting and complex. And as a result, I also had to make some modifications to the original Jobs API, the one that we just completed in the previous project. So, long story short, in our next project, we'll use Jobs API as our base. And during the project, we'll add some additional features as well as change some of the existing Jobs API code. Now, since in my experience, some students don't like to work in such a way, basically, they prefer to start a project from scratch each and every time. Technically, this project is optional. Let me repeat, technically, this project is optional. If you don't like to configure existing code base, feel free to skip this project. Now, why did I add this extra project? As you can see, I'm recording this project later. So the projects that are coming up actually were recorded prior to this project. Well, there are a few reasons why I recorded this project. First, I think this will be a good practice for us to work with an actual front end, not just the postman, since that's something that you'll encounter while working on the full stack applications. Second, I wanted to showcase that we already have enough knowledge to build quite complex server applications. And it's easier to achieve that, basically to showcase that, if we have the final application, not just making the postman request. Like I already mentioned, we worked on the front end in my React course. So front end is ready to go. Our goal in this project is to create a server that sends back proper responses. Basically, we need to create a server that powers this front end application. As far as the intro, I think I'll stop right here since we'll cover each and every feature of this application in great detail later on as we're working on a project, and I don't want to waste too much of your time. But if you do want to see complete project in action, basically, if you want to take it for a test drive, just visit this URL. So you're looking for Redux Toolkit Jobster.netlify.app. Again, the URL is Redux Toolkit Jobster.netlify.app. And once you get here, you have multiple options. You can register. Once you have registered, you can log in, or you can simply go with this demo app feature. And essentially, you'll be able to take a look at the application in the test user mode. Just like the other projects, we're going to start in the main repo. And like I mentioned before, I recorded this project later. So if you don't see 06.5 Jobster API in your repo, then please get the repo one more time. Again, the reason for that and the reason why I have these funny numbers here is because I recorded this project later. Now, once you get the repo, once you can see that there is a project, navigate to the star, and more specifically, you're looking for the README. And here you'll find all the steps we're going to take during the project. So this is something that I started doing in the courses, and for the most part, I would say like 95% of the students really like it. Because essentially, this allows you to work on a project separately. So in here, you can see what step we're going to take, and you can stop the video and work on that. And second, pretty much I took the notes for you. So I have every intention to keep setting up projects this way. Again, in the README here, you'll find all the steps we're going to take as we're building this project. And essentially, when it comes to Starter, it's a final application from the Jobs API. This is a complete Jobs API project. Like I said, we'll modify some code and we'll add some features. Now, also, there is some additional data, for example, client here. So this is where our front-end application lives. Don't worry, we'll get there shortly. So the first thing that I want you to do is open up the integrated terminal and navigate to, again, this funny 0.6.5 Jobster API, more specifically Starter. And in order to do that, I'm just going to go with CD. So I'm going to navigate here, grab the folder, and I can see that I'm located in this directory. Then we want to install dependencies, which we can do with npm install. Like so. Again, those are going to be the same exact dependencies we already installed. We also need to set up .env. Now, this is really up to you. You can take the .env from the previous project, Jobs API. The variables and the values can be exactly the same. Just I would suggest changing the database name in the connection string. And therefore, I'll set up everything one by one. So first, let me navigate to the Starter. I'm going to create a new file. And let me zoom out right now. I'm looking for .env. So this is where we'll set up our environment variables. And just so I can save a little bit of time on typing, I'll grab all of the variables, and one by one we'll set up the values. Let's start with the easiest one, which is essentially a lifetime. So as far as my JSON web token, I'll leave it as 30 days. Then let me grab the secret. And if you remember the previous project, I showed you a site where you can get a nice value. So I'll take this one. That's going to be my secret. And then lastly, we want to set up the Mongo URI. Again, you can copy from the previous project. Just make sure to create a new database. So in my case, I'm going to navigate back to MongoDB. Then I'm looking for the database here. I'm going to go with connect. I'll use this connect the application. And notice how now they don't provide the testing or whatever was their default value. So now essentially we'll have to come up with a name over here. So let me copy this one. I'll set it up here in the .env. Now, of course, I'll pause the video and add the password. For now, what I want to do is go with 0.65, and then I'll call this Jobster and API, or just Jobster, I think is going to be good enough. So let me pause the video. Let me set up the proper password, and then we want to run the npm start. Now, since it's pretty much as we deployed it in the previous project, we'll run it with Node. Don't worry, we will switch it to a Node one. The end result should be servers listening on such and such port. So this is what you should see in the integrated terminal. If you don't, please troubleshoot. Otherwise, you won't be able to follow along. So now let me set up the password and let me spin up the server. All right, and once my environment variables are in place, let me go with npm start. And since everything is correct, I can see that in terminal server is listening on port 5000. And if you have the same result, we can move on to the next step. Okay, and we're going to start this project by doing a little bit of spring cleaning. So I'll remove some stuff from the Jobs API that we won't use in this particular project, the Jobster one. And I'm going to start by removing the Swagger. Since we'll have the front end, there's really no need for the documentation. So in here, first, I want you to remove these lines of code in the app.js. I want to remove the import for Swagger UI. The same goes for the YAML file. And also, I don't want to load it. And then We don't need to set up the homepage. Again, we'll have the working front end. And the same goes for the API docs. So let's start there. First, I'm going to navigate to app.js. And then I'm going to look for these 3 lines of code. I can also remove the comment as well. There's really no need. Then let's keep on scrolling. And over here, we want to remove the homepage and API docs. Now let's save it. Of course, nothing is going to happen in the integrated terminal. Like I said, we are running Node right now. Something we're going to fix in this video. So essentially, if you want to see the changes, then of course you need to restart the server, but I'm not going to do that. So now let's navigate back to the README. Let's see what we want to do. We want to remove the limiter. So in this project, I'll show you how we can set up a limiter so we can limit requests on specific route. So on the jobs API, it was pretty much for the whole API. So in this case, we're going to be very selective, where we're only going to limit this to a register as well as the login one. And that is all coming up. For now, what I want to do is just removing the app.js, the rate limiter, as well as these 2 lines of code. So let's set that one up. We're in the app.js. We want to remove this, and then we want to keep on moving, and we want to move these 2 suckers as well. So what's next? Well, I want to remove the course library as well. Why? Well, because when we were creating the jobs API, we wanted the external applications to access our API. That was the whole point. We just built the server. Now, in this case, not only we're going to have a server, we'll also have the front end. And I only want our front end to access it. So there's really no need for the course. That's why I'm going to navigate back. And I guess, let me just be consistent. I'll remove this one first. So the import goes first, and then the second, we want to look for the invocation. So let's remove this. So that should do it as far as the code. Now let's focus on the package JSON. So first, we want to switch from the node to a nodemon. Now, if you want, of course, you can just change the command, where instead of node, just write nodemon and then app.js. Pretty much is going to work since we have installed the package. But in my case, I want to keep the start script for the Heroku. Since again, we will push this up to a Heroku. That's why I'll add additional script. So let me navigate to the package JSON. We're going to go with dev or whatever name makes the most sense for you. And trust me, I will most likely forget quite a few times, and I'm just going to run npm start, and then I wonder why the server is not updating, but that's my problem. So in here, I'm going to go with nodemon and then app.js. And then, of course, we can right away spin it up, correct? So we can go with npm run and then dev. So let's stop it here, npm run dev. And now the nodemon is running our server. Let's keep on moving. And I also want to change the engines. Again, it's not something that I'm worried about right now, since this only matters once we push this up to a Heroku. But I might as well change it right now since we're working in the package JSON. Why we want to do that? Well, because when I was recording, initially, let's say the jobs API was using 14, but now the latest stable version is 16. So we might as well fix that right now. So let me find it over here. Let me change it to 16. Now the last step, I believe, is just running npm run dev, which is something I'm already doing. So now, of course, let's just navigate to the browser and let's see whether we can see something. Now, keep in mind, of course, we have no homepage, nothing. We just have the routes over here and not found. So if everything is correct in the browser, we should see route not found. If that's the case, we are in a good place. So let me see. I'm going to navigate to the browser. We're going to go to localhost and then 5000. And I can see the text route does not exist, which again means that the functionality works. We just don't have the route. And with this in place, now we can move on to the next step. And once we're done with our spring cleaning, let's explore the client folder, which is going to be our front-end application. So here's what I'm going to do. In the star, I'm going to navigate to the client. And if you're familiar with React applications, this should look extremely familiar. Nope, that's not what I want to do. So effectively, this is a React application that I build with Create React App. And when I say I build, of course, we built it in my React course. And more specifically, if you take a look at the build folder, you'll notice something interesting. You'll notice a bunch of static assets. So I'm not sure whether you're familiar with React application. When you create a React application with Create React App, you have this option of basically taking all of your code and then creating a production-ready application, which is just a bunch of static assets. And this should also ring a bell simply because we have done that before already in this course. For example, Task Manager. The only difference that in there, I created these static files, these static assets myself, and I just added them. But the idea was the same. Whatever we place, let's say in a public, and then we use the express static, is going to be served as our public asset. So again, let me repeat, the deal here is exactly the same, where I'm using Create React App. And yes, as I said, if you want, you can use here the terminal, navigate to the client, install dependencies, spin up the server, the dev server, and this is different. So this is not our server that we're running with Nodejs. That's essentially a dev server that is running with Create React App. And essentially, this is what you do when you build a MERN application. In our case, since the application is already done, we're just bypassing this step. I went with npm run build out the production-ready application, and we have a bunch of static assets. And in the next video, we'll use these static assets as our front end. Hopefully, this makes sense. Now, if you did work on a project in my React course, and let's say if you want to use your own application, the only thing I changed was in the utils Axios, where I changed the base URL. If you remember from the React course, I used the server that is already running on Heroku. In this case, since the static assets will be on our own server, we don't need to have the long URL. I'm just going with API version 1, and then the rest is history. If you didn't work on a course, if you didn't work on a project, don't worry. Again, this is, in our case, irrelevant. Again, the most important thing is that just like in, let's say, the Task Manager, we had a public folder. In this case, we also have a folder with static assets, which we're going to use as our front end. So the only difference is that the path is going to be a little bit different. Hopefully everything is clear. Hopefully I didn't take too much of your time by explaining the front end. I just thought that it's very important that we're all on the same page. So now let's grab our React project and set it as our front end. Okay. And once we're familiar with the client folder, more specifically the contents of the build directory, now let's set up that folder as our front end application. And in order to do that, we'll need to get the path module. Remember, that's built into the node. And we want to go with express static, set it as our first middleware, and then serve all the static assets from the client /build. Now, if you're wondering, well, can we just set up the public folder and then copy and paste everything that we have in a build? Yeah, for sure we can do that. But I just wanted to showcase that sky is the limit. We also can use this approach where our static assets are in the entirely different folder. So we require the path, and then we go with app.use, express static, path.resolve, __ their name. So we get to the root, and then we navigate to client build. Now we do need to add a little bit more code, but let's just worry about this one for now. So I'm going to navigate to app.js. We want to go with path here. So we can do it probably above the security packages. So let's go with path. That is equal to require. Then we'll look for path module. Then let's keep on moving. We're looking for our first middleware. And in here, let's go with app.use. Then express static. So that's a special middleware that's provided by the Express. We go with path.resolve. And now we want to pass in underscore their name and comma. And then let's go to the client and then build. So that's the first step. Now, next, keep in mind that we still want to keep these API routes. So these ones we'll use in our front end. So the setup here is going to be following, where I want to grab the index.html from the client and serve it for all of the routes that are not part of my API. So these are my API routes for the auth, for the jobs. But for any other route, I want to serve the index.html. Remember, index.html is a special one. That's essentially our homepage. And if you're wondering, well, how is this possible? Because in here, in the client build, we have a specific router for the front end that pretty much takes all of the requests, apart from the ones that are going to the API. It takes those requests, and then it provides the actual page. Now, if the asset or the page doesn't exist, then of course we still go to not found middleware. And this is very important that we place it after these API routes because we still want to use it. So let's try it out. In the app.js, in between the API routes and the not found middleware, we want to go with our app.get. So pretty much all of the get requests, and that's what we'll place over here, star, will be served the index.html that is here in the client, in the build. And this effectively is going to be our homepage. And then from there, the front-end application, basically the React application, takes over. Hopefully that is clear. Again, this is typical how you set up the MERN project. Go here with res dot, and then we want to send the file. And again, we want to go with path.resolve. And we want to provide the index.html coming from the build. So in here again, we go with underscore their name, then comma, then let's go to the client, then build, and then another comma, and now we're looking for index and then HTML. Now, just to stay on the safe side, pretty much going to stop the server. I'm going to go with npm run dev. And let me double check. Maybe I missed something in my notes. Now we just want to navigate to localhost. So remember, the server is running on localhost 5000. So that's where our front end right now is located as well. And if you hit any roadblocks, make sure you clear out the storage, because the front end application relies on the storage. So especially initially, there might be some tiny bugs if you already have something in the local storage. So let's try it out. I'm going to navigate to the browser. I'm going to refresh the browser and check it out. I have the application. Again, if you have any kind of issues, let's say you have some kind of error on the screen, just go to the application, go to the localhost 5000, and make sure that it's clean. And then, of course, restart. Now, this is our landing page, as you can see. As far as the functionality, nothing works yet. For example, you cannot register yet or log in or whatever. All of that is coming up. For now, if you see the landing page, we are moving in the right direction. Okay. And once we have our front end in place, now let's start configuring our server. Essentially, our jobs API. So now we'll be transforming it into the Jobster one. And the first thing that I want to do in the models, in the user.js, I want to add two more properties. So when I set up the front end, I decided that there's also going to be a profile page where you can change the profile info about the user. And in there, you'll notice that there is a last name property as well as the location. And also, I use the location layer on the front end when we create the job. So as you change this location in the profile, it also gets automatically added in the job location. Now you can change this, of course, but by default, whatever is the user's location gets added. So now let's add those two properties. And then when we want to update the user, which is something that is coming up, we'll actually have those two properties. Because at the moment, if, let's say, we'll start setting up the update user route, which is going to be the route for the profile page, well, we don't have those two properties, so we cannot update them. So let me navigate to the user one. So all of this code stays the same. Essentially, we still have the name, we still have the email, the password, and all that. So that doesn't change. Simply what I want to do is add two properties, last name as well as the location. Now, for both of them, I'm going to be setting up some kind of default just because on our front end, initially, when the user registers or logs in, none of the values will be provided. So they will be only controlled in the profile page with the update user request. And since I want to have some kind of values in the database, for both of them, I'll add some default value. So I'm going to do it, I guess, after password. Let's just go with last name here. Then let's add type and then string. After that, we want to go with trim and set it equal to true. So this is going to trim the end as well as the start. And then we want to go with max length. And I don't want it longer than, let's say, 20. And like I said, just for kicks, I'm also going to add a default value, which is going to be equal to a last name. Now, location is going to be extremely similar. So in order to speed this up, I'm just going to copy and paste. It's not going to be a last name. It will be a location, type string, trim true, max length 20. That stays the same. And I'm just going to go with my city. That's it. Let's save it. And then in the next video, we will work on the register and logging controllers. Beautiful. And once we're done modifying our user model, next let's work on register and login controllers. So at the moment, if we take a look at the auth one, you can see that we're sending back the response, and it looks something like this, where we go res.status, status code, and then JSON. In here we have the user. We simply pass in the name, and we also send the token. But when I was building the front end, I realized that this type of structure is actually better. And this is the case where there's million different ways. And yes, I said million, because for every person who builds the front end, they might have a different opinion what makes sense more. Now, of course, when you're just setting up the API, when you're setting up the server, you're like, look, this is what I'm sending, so I don't really care how you build your application, but the structure is going to be like this. But when you build both the front end and the server, then of course, it depends what is your preference on the front end as well. And that's where the changes are happening, where you go like, okay, you know what? Maybe it's better if I just send the user as one big object, and in there I have the properties. Notice that the only difference as far as the actual properties, additionally, we're sending last name and location, something we just created. That's it. The email stays the same, the name stays there, as well as the token. So maybe for somebody else, they might structure it differently. In this case, yes, this is how we want to set up the response, because this is what the front end is expecting. And yes, if you're looking at it, you're like, okay, but technically from the front end, we're not providing these values when we log in or register. You're correct. So that's why we set them up by default. Basically, it's going to be that my city and the last name. And then from the update one, this is where the potentially new values are going to come in. Hopefully this makes sense. So here's what we want to do. Let's go to auth.js. We want to look for the register and login one. And we want to change the structure as well as add these two properties, what we're sending. Now for the register, of course, it's going to be created, the status code. And then for the login one, we're going to go with 200. So let's go to auth.js. Let's start here in the register. And let's change the structure where I'll send back one giant object, basically user object, because again, that's what the front end is expecting. And I'll set it equal to user.email. Then I also send the last name, which is going to be equal to user and last name. Then I'll also send the location. I'll say user location. Again, those two properties we just added. And I know I keep repeating this, but it's very important that we are on the same page. So user name. And then lastly, token is equal to token. So just like in the previous project, create the token and we send it back. Now let's go here and just grab the JSON. That's it. That's all we have to do. Let's keep on moving. And we'll do the same thing for the login. So let me remove everything after pretty much the dot. Let's copy and paste. And now we're sending back proper JSON. Now, it looks like somewhere messed it up. Nope, everything's fine. For some reason, it was a red. So now let's save it. And now let's go to a front end and let's see what is going to be a result. Now, of course, since I haven't created any users, I'll have to start with register. So let me go to the front end application. We have login or register option. And in the beginning, we want to go with register. So I'm going to go with my John, then gmail.com. And then let me provide some kind of password. So let me go here. Let's click submit. And if everything is correct, we have hello there, John. Now don't worry. The rest of the application is not going to work. We still need to make changes. That's how it's going to be. Slowly but surely, we will make sure that the server responds exactly like the front end is looking for. So if I go here now, I should have a user. So let me refresh, and there it is. Now I have my user with those default values, because again, we did not technically send them from the front end. We'll be able to update them later. But for now, I have John, gmail.com, as well as the last name and location. So now what we want to do is go back to the front end and let's test out the login one. Let's go here, login. Then again, let's navigate to the register page and we're looking for John and then whatever is your password. And once we provide the values, we should be able to log in. And again, we see the application. And once we have this one in place, now we'll worry about update user functionality. Okay. And once the login and register functionality work, before we set up update user, actually, let's create a test user. So eventually there will be a demo user that basically can bypass the register and the login option. So that way the person can come to the application and check it out. And first, let's start on the front end, just so you can see what's happening. So I'm going to open up the DevTools. I'm going to open up the network. And I think I'm going to go with the fetch one over here. And you'll notice that the moment you click Demo App, there is a login request. We can actually take a look at the payload. So notice, we have email and we have the password. So here's what we need to do. We need to create in our database such user. Now, don't worry. Of course, eventually we'll restrict certain actions for such user. Because if it's a demo user, I don't want that user to start modifying, let's say, the jobs data or the user info. But I want that user to be able to log in. And since we're sending the login request with such values as email and password, yes, we do need to create that user in the database. Now, you can create it in a Postman or the front end. And that's something that I want to mention. All of these requests that we're making, of course, you can run over to the Postman and make those requests. And who knows, maybe with some later functionality, I might do that as well. But kind of the main focus of this project is to showcase how the interaction takes place between the front end and the back end. Now, of course, when you're developing a full-blown MERN project, yes, you do use the Postman. That's not the point. But since the front end is already done, we might as well use that. And I think in my case, I'm going to use the front end, basically the application, to create such user. So I'm going to go with demo user. So name is really up to you. And then I'm going to go with email, test user, camel case here, at test.com, and then password secret. Now, do you have to make email and password exactly the same? Well, kind of. Because if you'll take a look at the front end, in the client source pages register.js, notice that we're dispatching this action login user, and these are the values that I'm providing. So if you use different values, yes, of course, you'll have to go to the front end and modify this code as well. And since I don't want to do that, I'm just going to go with these values. So name, email, as well as the password. So let me navigate back and let me register such user. So I'm going to go to register option, and then I'm going to say demo user again. This value, of course, is really up to you. Then let's go with test user at test.com. And then as far as the password, I'm going to go with secret. Let's submit. We should have that user right now in the database. So let me navigate back. Let me refresh. Yep, there it is. That's my test user. And we might eventually use this ID. But for now, we don't need to worry about it. Now what I want to do is go back to my application, log out, and now test my demo user. So in here, I'm going to go to the demo app. Let's click and notice now we have welcome back demo user, which is just awesome. That means that we have successfully created our test user. Not bad, not bad. I think we're done with our register page on the front end. So now let's start working on the pages within the dashboard. So this is essentially what we're going to do. One by one, we'll take a look at the pages we have, and we'll figure out what changes do we need to make on our back end so the front end functions as expected. We'll start over here with the profile. So effectively, this is the page where we can change data about the user. So in here, we can change the name, last name, email. Just remember that once we change the email, when we log in, the email that we need to provide is, of course, going to be the new one. That's kind of a gotcha. And then also we can change the city. Now, if you'll send a request, basically, if you'll click on Save Changes without providing one of the values, there is a check on the front end. Again, pretty typical setup where there are two checks, one on the front end, and then the second one is on the back end. Yes, that is there basically just so we're not sending some empty values to the database. That's something to keep in mind. So let's say if I want to change the name of my demo user. And as a side note, in here also, there's the current name of that user. Well, I can provide a name John. And then again, let's take a look at our best friend, the network tab. Let's see what kind of request are we sending, what values, more specifically, what route and all that. And then based on that, we'll make changes on our backend. Before I send it though, let me clean out the network tab just so I can see the latest request. And now let me go back. Let's click on Save Changes. And notice, so we're making a request to a following endpoint. And at the moment we have 404, which is exactly what we expected, since this is what we're going to do in the following videos. So let's take a look at the headers. So the request is going to localhost 5000 API and all that. So we already knew that. And then we have auth and update user. So that's the route we'll have to create. Now notice the method. This is going to be a batch route. And also let's take a look at the payload. So notice we have email, last name, location, and name. So these are the values that we're expecting on a backend. And then once we get the values in, then we'll modify the user. And once everything is correct, we'll be able to send back the proper response, what the front end is looking for. And then, of course, we'll be able to update the user data on the front end. And the first thing we need to understand that this request will be authenticated request. So if you remember in a previous project, in the Jobs API, in the app.js, we stick the middleware, authenticate user in front of the jobs. So all the job routes were authenticated. So I only can create a job that belongs to me. I can modify it. I can delete it. And hopefully you see where I'm going with this. So the same over here. I don't want Peter to log in and then start changing some data about the John. So that's why we'll have to make sure that this route, the one that we're about to create, the update user one, is also protected. And what do? Well, we get the middleware and we stick it in front of the update user. So let's start here by navigating to the auth one. And we want to create that new controller. I'm going to call this update user. So let's navigate over here, the auth one. And right after the register and login, I'm going to go with const. And let's say update user is equal to, we want to go with async, of course, rec and res. And then for now, I want to log two things. I want to log the user just so you can see that the functionality works. And also I want to log rec.body so we can see that we're actually getting those values from the front end. So let's go over here. Let's say console and log. And first, rec.user. Now, how do I know that the user is going to be there? Well, if we take a look at the auth middleware that we're about to set up for this route, we know that we check for the token, we split and all that, we verified, and then this is what we're attaching to the request, the user object. And in there we have two things. We have user ID as well as the name. And both of these things, of course, we're sticking into the token when we create the JWT token. So let's navigate back and let's just say here another log. And in this log, I want to go with that rec.body. I just want to see what we're getting basically back. So let's say here rec.body. Now, as far as the response, don't worry about it. It can be basically nothing. Yes, the front end is going to be hanging. Yes, there's going to be some bugs and all that. We don't care about it. For now, I just want to see whether we're getting those values on a backend. So once we set this one up, we want to go with update user. So that's the controller we created. And now we want to go back to all the routes, the auth routes, and we want to set it up. So first, let's look for such folder. Then I'm looking for routes one. And in here, notice I have only register and login. So I also need to get the update user. And we also need to get authenticate user, the middleware, correct? So we can copy and paste, of course, from the app.js one. But I think in this case, I'm just going to go with the regular import where I'm going to say require. And we're looking 2 levels up or 1 level up, sorry. We're looking in the middleware. Then we want to go with authentication. And now we have the middleware. And right after the register and the login one, I'm going to go with router. Now remember, it's a patch request. So we're modifying existing data. It's not a post. It's not a get. It's a patch. Then we say, well, what is going to be the route? Again, let's just check with the front end to make sure. If you take a look at the headers, where is the request going? It's going to auth and then update user. So let's do that. We're going to go with update user and then comma. Then let's stick the middleware, the authentication middleware. And then after that, we're going to go with update user. So that's the controller. And of course, in here, I need to go with authenticate and then user. Let's save this. Now let's try it one more time. Now again, the main point is going to be on a backend. So for now, let's try it one more time. Now notice that we have successful request technically. I mean, we're not getting anything back, but technically we have successful request. Now the payload doesn't change again. This is what we're sending. What I'm more interested is the server. And now check it out. I have the user with user ID such and such, as well as the name. And I have these values. And we're going to use both of these things to set up proper functionality to update the user. Just please keep in mind 3 things. First, it's a patch request. Second, it goes to auth and then update user. And third, it is a authenticated request, meaning it's restricted to a certain user. Okay, now let's complete the update user controller. First, we'll check for the values. And if one of them is missing, we'll send back the bad request. And yes, I know I'm repeating, but we already have that check on the front end. But on a normal application, you have the checks for the empty values on front end as well as the back end. Then we want to get the user. Remember, we have user ID. And then we're looking for underscore ID because that's the property name that the Mongo sets it up. And now we want to change these values in such a way. Now, $1 million question, can you use find one and update? Yes, of course you can. But I just want to showcase that this is also an option where we can go with user.email, name, and rest of the values. Again, we get back the user, and the user should be there because basically we're setting up that user ID in the JWT token. And once I get the user, I want to update these values. Then I want to go with await and user save. I want to save the user. Then I want to use the create JWT instance method. And I'll talk about the necessity for creating such token at the end of the video. And then we want to send back the exact response that we already have in the login and register. So this is very important. Again, we need to send back this giant user object. And once we do that, then the front end will get all the correct data. And then right away, we'll update the values in all the necessary places. So let's start here. First, I guess I can remove those logs. It's pretty clear that we're getting those values. And now let's check for email, name, last name, and location. And then all of them are coming from rec.body. So email, name, last name. And also we want to look for location. That is equal to rec. And then body. Then we want to go with the if check. And I want to say that if one of the values is missing, well, then we want to throw that bad request. Now let me check whether I have imported. Yep. Looks like it's already in place. So it's going to be smooth sailing. So in here, I'm going to go with name. Then we'll look for the last name. So if last name is missing, or of course, we also have the location. So if one of the values is missing, which again, we check on the front end, then we go with throw new and then bad request. And then we want to provide some kind of message. And in my case, I'm going to go with please provide all values. Let's save this. Then we want to get the user from the database. So const user is equal to await. Then user model find and then one. In my case, I'm going to go with underscore ID is equal to rec user ID. And if you're still curious where we're getting the property, please go to the authentication middleware and you'll see how we're setting up the user object. Then one by one, I want to change these values. So they're coming in from the front end. So I want to change them. Yes. I mean, it might be the case where we're not changing anything. For example, if I'm changing the name here, rest of the values are exactly the same. That's totally fine. I still want to make sure that if there are any changes, then we update. And then basically we want to copy and paste, and we want to change these values around here, where it's not going to be email, it's going to be name. Then we want to go with a last name, and then lastly, we want to set it up as a location, I believe. Yep. Let me go here and let's say location. Let's save this. Then we want to save the user. So let's go with await user.save. Save it. And now let's create that token. So we're going to go here with const token is equal to user create JWT. Let's invoke it. And just so we can speed this up a little bit, let me take this response from the login. So basically I'm looking at everything starting with the res.status and with the parentheses. So let me copy this one and copy and paste. Let's try it out on the front end, and then we'll talk about the create JWT. So when do we need to create it and when it's actually fine. So let's try it out here. I'm going to refresh so we can start from the scratch, and then let's try it out. So notice over here I have demo user. Let me change this to a John. And then once we send notice, we have success. So we successfully updated the front end. And notice we can even take a look at the response. So this is what we're sending back. That's what the front end is expecting. And also notice how the name changed over here. Again, the only gotcha here is the fact that if you change the email, then also when you log in, you need to provide that new email. And as far as the JWT, do we need to create one? Well, that depends on two things. First, that depends whether we're sticking some kind of value that possibly might be different. And if we take a look at our JWT when we create, we actually pass the name here as well. So in this case, yes, we do need to create a new token because name value possibly might be different. Correct? Now, if we wouldn't be adding this name, then technically we're not changing the ID. Correct? So in that case, it's really up to you. Why would you want to send a new token? Well, then that gives a new expiration. So technically, if you have whatever expiration every time you create a new one, you extend that expiration. So this is really where you would need to make a decision. If you don't have any values that you're changing here, then technically you can get away with not sending a new token. Since our case, we do have that name. I mean, I don't want to send, let's say, a token with an old name. I always want it to be up to date. And with this in place, we're done with update user functionality. And now we can start working on our next page, which is going to be add job. Beautiful. We're done with update user functionality, but there's one major gotcha. So if you updated the user and you tried to log in, you probably noticed that the response is invalid credentials. So let's fix that. First, I just want to mention that when we update our user in such a way where we go with .save, this instance method, so instead of find one by ID and update, if we go this route, we trigger the hooks, pre-save and post-save. Now, that is not a good thing or a bad thing. So this is not a video where I say, hey, you shouldn't use this. You should use find one and update. No, it really depends on what is the situation and what is your preference. So you can definitely use here find one and update, or you can use this approach. And I want you to be aware of both of them. And this is the reason why, in this case, we went different route, because I want you to see what happens when we trigger that hook. Now, the reason why we won't be able to log in is simply because if we take a look at our user, we do have pre-save hook. And like I just said, we are triggering when we go with user.save. Now, what do we have here in the pre-save hook? Well, we hash the password, correct? And what happens when we update the user, we hash the password one more time. And as a result, our original password doesn't match anymore. So let me showcase that. I'm going to go back to my application. I'm just going to create a new user. I'm going to go over here with Peter, then peter@gmail.com, and then I'll provide the password. So everything is awesome. I'm going to showcase that, yes, we have the stats and all that. So let me log out. Let me log in one more time. I know that might be annoying for some people. Let me just showcase that. Everything is correct as far as the login. It's going to work. However, once we go to a profile and change anything here, again, it doesn't have to be an email. Any field over here, let's say if we change it to John, once we save the changes, yes, the user will be updated and everything is correct. However, we won't be able to log in anymore. So if we go here with peter@gmail.com and we provide the same exact password, we'll get invalid credentials. And you'll get the same thing with the demo one, the one that we changed in the previous video. So if that's the case, don't freak out. We'll fix it in a second. But I do suggest pretty much removing all the existing users that you have right now, because otherwise it's not going to work. Right now, the values are different as far as the password because it was already hashed one more time. Now, first, I just want to showcase how we can check these fields and what solution we're going to have. So effectively, we'll check for the path that is modified. So when we are talking about these hooks, we have this dot. So again, this references the model, and we can go with modified paths. So we can check, well, which paths are we modifying? And more specifically, I can say, look, if I'm not modifying the password, which we are not. Again, yes, there are different routes that we can set up to modify the password, but this is not the case. We're not modifying the password. And if we're not modifying the password, I also don't want to hash it one more time. And that's why I'll go here with return. So first, let me just showcase where we can see the paths. So I'm just going to take it from a README just so it's quicker. So I'm going to go back to user and I'll just log it, I guess. So let me go with log here, copy and paste this dot modified paths. Okay, let me remove the semicolon here. And now I just need to log in somehow, some way. So I guess I'll just create another user. In this case, I'll just say that the username is David. One more time over here, David. And then let's submit. We'll be able to log in. We check the profile, and let's say if we change the name again to a Peter or whatever, and we'll save the changes, you'll notice over here that this dot modified paths returns a name. So we know that we're actually modifying the name. So in our case, like I just mentioned, we simply want to run this dot is modified, and we can check for specific path. In our case, that path is password. And if we're not modifying the password, then we simply want to return. Again, we don't have a route to modify the password. But in general, if you do, that's when you hash the new password, but not the current password. Again, we don't want to hash it for the second time. So now let's go back to the user. Again, you can leave this for your reference, but since we already have the README, I'll delete it. And I'll say if, and then this dot modified, or I'm sorry, is modified over here. And if we're not modifying the password, which we are not, because we have all the other fields, then we simply want to return. And now we finally fix this bug. So now let me go to my database. I want to again remove all the users, and I'll set up that test user one more time, because that's the functionality that I definitely want to have in my application. So let me remove the users, and I'll see you on the other side when we create a new test user. Okay, and once I've removed all the users, now let me log out over here. Let me register one more time the test user. And remember that the name is really up to you, but the email needs to be testuser@test.com, and the password needs to be secret. And I'm just going to go with demo user. So let me register. So now we create that user. And now let me, I guess let's change something around here. Let's just say demo, save changes, then let's log out and let's try the demo app route. And if everything is correct, if we have welcome back demo, then we have successfully fixed the bug. Okay, and up next we have add job page. So on this page we can add job. We need to provide position, company, and also some extra properties. For example, job type, something we didn't have in the jobs API, as well as the job location. So again, this is going to be tied to a user's location. So if we go back to the profile and let's say we're going to go with, I don't know, Los Angeles. If we save, if we go to add job, notice by default, the user's location is going to be provided. Now, of course, you can change this value. You can provide a different city, but the idea is that, I mean, for the most part, user is going to apply for a job in his or her area. So the first thing we want to do as far as the server, we want to create these two properties on the job. Because at the moment, if we take a look at our job model, so we have company position, we have the status. So this one is not going to change. We have created by, because each job is tied to the user. But we also need to provide these two properties. We need to provide a job type, which is going to be string. However, it's going to be an enum value. And notice from the front end, we have select one. So when it comes to a job type, these are basically going to be our options. And also we have job location. By default, we're just going to go with my city. Now, again, the values will be provided for the front end. So default properties pretty much there just for fun. So let's start in the job model where right after created by, let's create that job type. Let's go here. Let's say job type. This is going to be equal to type string. Then we'll go with the enum values. And these are the passable values. Just make sure that they are exact as I'm typing. Otherwise, you'll have some bugs. So full-time here, that's the first option. Then we have part-time here. After that, we have remote. And then lastly, we have internship. Something that I have problems spelling. So let me make sure that I don't mess it up. Then let's go with default. I'll go with full-time. And we want to set up the job location as well. So let's go here with job location. Then we'll set up the type string. So that stays the same. After that, we have default. And I'm just going to go with my city. And then lastly, we have required. And I'm going to set it equal to true. So let's save it. And what you'll notice that pretty much since we have all of the job routes in place, we can do a full-blown CRUD already on all of the jobs. So we'll be able to add the job, check all the jobs, remove the job, as well as edit the job. Again, if you need a refresher, and by the way, there's a tiny bug, there's a comma missing. But if you need a refresher, let's just go back to the jobs. Notice we can get all the jobs that are tied to the user. And yes, the front end is going to be totally happy with the response that we're sending. Then we can get a single job, which actually in the front end we're not using. We also can create the job. So this is what we're going to do first. Then we can update the job. And also we can delete the job. So let's try it out. Once we have added those two properties, we should be good to go. So let's start here with, let's say, position front end, and then company is going to be Google, because why not? Then let's go with submit. Notice we have successful request to the jobs. Again, as always, let's just double check what's happening. So we're sending this request to jobs. It's a post request. This is the payload. This is the values we are providing. And then this is our response. So this is what the server is sending back. Something we already set up in a previous project, the jobs API. Notice the front end is saying, yep, you successfully created a job. So we're pretty much done with this page, to tell you honestly. And we have some of the features already complete in the all jobs. So if I navigate here now, notice I'll have my job. So the front end is going to make a request where? To the jobs, but this is a GET request. And yes, there's a query string that we're going to work on a little bit later. For now, just check. We're looking for the jobs. And then basically this is the response. We send back the array of jobs. Now, if let's say I'm going to add another job, we can delete it and we can also edit. So let's go here. Let's say that this is going to be a backend developer and company is going to be a Netflix. Let's submit. Let's create a job, then all jobs. And now we have 2 jobs. And since I want to test it, I'm going to go to edit. Notice at this point, we're not sending a request. We just move back in the front end to the add job page. However, in this case, we'll send the batch request. And then just for kicks, let's change this to a front end. Let's send it. Now check it out. We are actually making this request to a jobs. We provide the ID. And effectively, this is a batch request, correct? So we change this around. And if I go back to all the jobs, then of course, now the value is a front end. So we successfully edited the job. So now what we want to do, we want to go with delete. We also want to check that. Notice here. And as a side note, I need to clean out, otherwise I'm not going to be able to see. And let me just remove the last job here. So notice, now I go with delete request. And then of course we fetch all the jobs. So that's the setup on the front end. So every time we make a delete request, we make another get request to get all the jobs. Now, of course, at this point, the John user, I think this is my test user, correct? Well, this user technically doesn't have any jobs. So first, let me change it back to a test user as far as the name. And then I'm not going to manually add the jobs. We're actually going to use an awesome resource for that. And I'm going to talk about it in more detail in the next video. So for now, I just want to reiterate that we successfully pretty much set up the whole CRUD functionality. So we already did the bulk of the work, of course, in the previous project, in the jobs API. We just added these 2 properties, and now we successfully can create jobs. We can look at all the jobs. We can delete as well as edit. And if you need a refresher, then again, please go back to the jobs controller and you'll see all of the functionality, because this functionality is not going to change. This one will stay exactly the same apart from get all jobs, which is something we're going to do a little bit later. Okay. And once we're done with the CRUD functionality, now let's complete the all jobs page. And if you navigate to the complete project, and the URL is Redux Toolkit Jobster.notify that app. And if you log in as a test user, you'll notice that there is actually a search functionality in place. And there's also a pagination. But in order to set it up, we need to add more jobs. And at this point, we have multiple options. You can either do it manually, so one by one, go and create the jobs, or we can use a nice resource for that, and the resource name is macro. So this is what I'm going to do in this video. I'll basically programmatically create those jobs, and then next video we will populate the database. Now in my case, I'm going to do that with a test user. So I'm going to use a test user ID because I want the people who are visiting the application to see the functionality. However, of course, you can use, let's say, your ID. So this is really up to you. I'm going to go with test user, but technically you don't have to. Now, if you're looking for a resource, just take a look at the README. So this is going to be the actual URL, but of course you can navigate there like so by clicking on it. And essentially this is an awesome resource to create fake data. And the way it works, we just go with field name and then what type of field it's going to be. And of course, you'll see in a second how everything works. So I'm going to start by just removing the rest of the fields. And the only thing that I want to reiterate is that you need to use the same exact field name like we have right now in the model. So if we take a look at the job model, the properties that we set up need to match exactly. Otherwise, it's not going to work. We'll try to insert that in a database, and if the properties don't match, then it's not going to make sense. So one by one, we'll set up company, position, the status, created by. So this is where we'll add that test user ID, at least in my case, then the job type, job location, and also when it was created. And I'm going to talk about the dates and all that once we get there. So first, let's start here by providing a company. And here we want to go with a value. And in this case, I'm going to be looking for a fake company name. And as you can see, they have tons of options. And I'm literally talking about tons of options. So yes, these are pretty much all the options you can provide for the values. So I guess I'm going to go with fake company name. This is just going to create whatever rows. Now, they're over-exaggerate a little bit. We're probably not going to go with 1,000, but yes, this is going to basically create 1,000 or whatever rows you set up with that fake company name. And in my case, I'm going to go with JSON. So just to showcase, let's see. Let's go here with a preview. Notice, basically it creates an array of objects where there's a company property. And then we have all of these fake values, which is, again, is really awesome when you're developing the application. So let me go back and let's add another field. Now this one will be position. And as far as the value, we're looking for the job title. So let's go here and job title. So this is the one that will be added. Then we want to go with job type, status, and created by. And we want to go with custom list, which will essentially allow us to add these values for the statuses, for the job type, as well as created by. So let's go here one by one. Let's add them. I'm going to go with a job type. We want to go here with a custom list. And then essentially we can just grab the values from the enum. The only thing we'll need to do is just remove the quotation marks. So copy and paste, just make sure that there are no quotation marks like so. So one by one, let me remove them. Then let's create the status. Same deal. We'll just create type and it will be custom list. So let me look for, or I'm sorry, you know what? I messed it up. I went with job type. This actually should be status. My bad. Now let me look for the job type. It's going to be over here. And again, same deal. We just want to remove the quotation marks. And once we do that, we have the ID to that. If you remember, the property is created by, correct? So let's add another field. Let's make sure that the name is exactly the same. It's going to be custom list. But now I'm going to navigate to a MongoDB and I want to grab the test user, the demo one. So I want to take this value over here. Now there is actually a value for the MongoDB, but I'm not going to worry about it right now. I'm just going to set it up as a custom list. But if you do check the values, there's actually, I think there, as far as I remember, there was one for MongoDB. And then the last one is created by. And remember, that's the one we're adding with these timestamps true. Now, why do we want to set it up? Because we'll have a stats one where we want to display how many applications we have basically sent out in the last 6 months. So that's why we need to set up the dates. And technically you can add essentially the same date. So if I'm not going to provide that value, it will be added automatically. Because remember, that's the whole point with timestamps. But what's really cool that once we'll add these jobs programmatically to the database, once we populate the database, we can actually go with a date that's sometime in the past, which is exactly what I want to do. So I'm going to go here with add another field, and we're going to go with created and then add. And now let's go with a different one. So in this case, we want to go with date and time. Now, you can basically leave this as 1 year if you want, but just because I want to showcase something later on when we work on the stats, I'll actually go 2 years. I'm going to go here, let's say to the July. So, and then as far as the format, we're looking for this ISO one. Now, I don't want null values, so make sure that I don't have that. And I also don't want like 1,000. Again, let me take a look at the preview. Let me just make sure that the properties here are exactly like I have in the model. Otherwise, it's not going to work. And it says status specified more than once. Okay, yeah, because I didn't change this one. So this should be a job type. My apologies. So let's try here one more time. And this is what we should see in the preview. So we have company, position, status, job type, created by, and created at. And notice how created at is basically different dates. Now, once we have this one in place, we want to go with, of course, JSON, like I said, and I'm going to bypass the include null values. And now we want to download this data. Now, this is saved as mock data JSON, and you can definitely leave it the way it is, but I always prefer actually lowercase, so I'm just going to say mock data JSON. And then we want to drag this sucker to the root of our project. So I'm looking for Jobster API here, then the starter, and then this needs to be in the root. So let me drag it here. Going to be now in the starter. So if I navigate back to my VS Code, I should see it somewhere over here. Now, if you want to prettify this, just save it in VS Code and we'll do the job for you. So I'm going to navigate to this file, save it, and notice now it's not minified anymore. So next video, what we're going to do is add these jobs to our database. So we'll set up a function, something, by the way, we did in the project. What was it? I believe, the store API. We already did that in there. So basically, we'll repeat some of the steps to add these jobs to our database. Notice how all of them are going to be tied to my test user, since that's the ID that I'm using over here. Beautiful. And once we have the mock data in place, now let's populate our database with these values. And like I mentioned already in a previous video, essentially we already did that in the project 04 store API. So essentially this is going to be a refresher. Now, if you want to just copy and paste the code, you can definitely do so, but in my case, I will recreate it from scratch. So let's go to our Jobster API starter. Let's create a new file. Let's call this populate.js. Now in here, here's what we want to do. Let's grab .env, since we'll need our Mongo URI. We want to get mock data. And what's really cool in Node that when it comes to JSON, we can simply require. So this is going to get our data. Now, in this case, I'm looking for the job, not the product. So if you copy and paste, please change that. You also want to connect to DB. And I will set up another start function. It's going to be a sync. Again, try catch. Let's connect to DB. If we're successful, then let's create these jobs. Let's pass in the data. Then let's log success and let's exit. And if there's an error, let's just log it. And let's go with process.exit. So let me navigate to a populate. Let's start with the .env, since we'll need that Mongo URI. Let's right away run config. So invoke that. Then we want to get the mock data. So that is equal to require. And we're going to be looking for our JSON one. So require, then we want to go with mock and data JSON. After that, let's grab the job model, which is equal to a job. So require, it's in the same folder since we're in the root. So we're looking for models and then / job. And then lastly, we want to get the connect as well. Const connect db, and that is equal to require. And we want to pass in the db. And more specifically, we want to look for the connect file. Once we have this one in place, let's go with start, which is going to be our function. It's going to be a sync function. And here, let's right away invoke it. So let's go with start. And we will set up a try catch block. In the try block, effectively, we will try to connect to a database. So we'll say here await connect db. That's our function. We want to pass in the process.env.mongo_URI or whatever is your variable name. And then let's go with await job. So that's the model. And then we'll look for create and let's pass in mock data. So if we're successful, we just want to log this. So I'm going to say log something success or whatever. And then I want to exit the process as well. So success and 3 exclamation points and then process and exit. And let's pass in the 0. Now, if there's an error, then we want to go with console log and we're looking for the error. And also we want to go with process.exit. However, in this case, we'll pass in the 1 if there is an error. So we get this. Let me just check mock data. Yep, job, everything's correct. So now I want to go back to my terminal. I want to stop the server. I'll clear everything. And I'm just going to go with node and then populate. And we can add JS or we can skip it. Doesn't really matter. And we can see the success. Now, in order to double check that, we have 2 options. We can go to the front end or we can go to a database. Now I'll showcase both of them. So let me navigate to the Mongo. Let me refresh. There should be jobs. And we'll also see those jobs here on the front end. So those are my users. And these are my jobs. And notice I have 75. That's the one that I created. And basically all of them are tied to my test user. So I think I can close this one for now, the final one. And let me just take a look at all the jobs. So let me refresh. Now, of course, there's an error because I didn't start the server. So let me clear again. And let me go with npm run dev. And the filter functionality is not going to work. I can tell you right away. Also, we won't be able to see the pagination, but we should see all these jobs again. Just make sure that you log in with the user whose ID you used to create those jobs. And if you can see all of these jobs in the all jobs page, now we can set up the filter functionality as well as the pagination on the server. And as a result, our front end is also going to have that functionality. All right, and up next, let's complete all jobs page by setting up the filter functionality on the server. Before we go over the general concepts, let me just say that the upcoming code is almost identical to the project number 4, the Store API, where we got introduced to the main concepts of filtering, sorting, and the pagination. So if at any point you feel like I'm moving too fast, or you just need to jog your memory on the main concept, please reference the Store API project, since in there we move at the slower pace, and I cover each step in a greater detail. With that said, the main idea is following. So at the moment, if we take a look at the get all jobs controller, we can see that we're essentially looking for all the jobs that belong to a certain user. Again, this is not going to change. We'll only look for the jobs that belong to a specific user. That's the main idea. But at the moment, I'm sending back all of the jobs. So essentially, we just sort by created at. However, if we take a look at the front end, we notice that there are quite a few inputs. And as you're changing something in these inputs, you also notice that the query params in the request change as well. So, for example, if I'm going to start typing something in the search box, if we navigate to a network tab, we can see that, yes, the request goes to jobs. But in here we have query params. We have status, job type, we have sort, we have page, as well as the search. And as you can imagine, as we're going to be changing something in these inputs, we'll send out another request to the jobs. However, the value in that particular key is going to change. So now notice, in here I have status is equal to decline. And I'm not going to show each and every input. Hopefully you see the main idea that yes, every time we'll change something in these inputs, we'll send out a new request, and the value in that query param, in that key, is going to change. Now, when it comes to the status and type, we notice that we have these values and we also have all. And if you're wondering where these values are coming from for the status and the job type, well, you don't need to look any further than the job. And notice over here, so for the status, we have this enum. So these are the same values on the front end, as well as for the job type. So the only extra here is all. And all essentially just means that we are getting all the jobs regardless of the status. So basically status could be interview, it could be decline, it could be pending. Now, when we specifically say, hey, get me all the jobs where the status is interview, then of course we're performing a filter and we're getting only the jobs where the status is equal to an interview. Hopefully that is clear. So these ones basically are gonna set up the filter, the search status and type. And as a side note, when it comes to search, we will search the position and we'll just look for a text value. So we'll set up a regex and we'll say, hey, get me all the jobs where in a position there is the text coming from the input. And then when it comes to the sort, well, this one will chain to the original query that we set up with search status and type. And as you can see, the values are following. We have latest, we have oldest, we have A to Z, and we have Z to A. And at the very end, we'll also set up the pagination. But for now, let's just worry about the filter functionality. And effectively, in the controller, first what we want to do, we want to grab these values from rec query. Again, we can first log the query, of course, that's always an option, but I'm telling you right away that these are the values that I will be looking for. And then if you remember, we needed to set up a separate object because we won't right away go with await. So we'll set up that await later. First, we'll set up the query. So set up the query object. And the first thing that I want to pass in is the user ID. Because again, we always want to start with, well, who's the owner of those jobs? Because I don't want, let's say, Peter to log in and then look at John's jobs. Or John to log in and look at Susan's jobs. I only want that specific user to see his or her jobs. So that's why we'll set up the query object. First is going to be created by, and then conditionally we'll add these properties. So if the search exists, then we'll create position. Why? Well, because that's the property name in our job model, correct? If we go back over here, notice there's company, but there's also a position. We set up query object. So that's the object. And then we go with key, the position, and this one will be equal to a regex. So we have here this operator regex one, and we just pass in the search. So that way we can not only look for the starting value, the ending one, we can right away check, well, if there is such value anywhere in the position. And when it comes to options, we're just going with I, which essentially means that we don't care about the casing. And then we'll look for status and all that. And like I said, first we're going to go with job.find and then pass in the query object. So as you can see, these ones are optional. And once we have the result, we'll also chain the sort conditions. And then once we're done with the pagination and all that, then we will await for the results. And then there's a little bit more code after that, because we also want to send how many pages and what is the total amount of jobs. So these are the general concepts. And before we start setting up the logic, I just want to quickly mention that in the latest Mongoose version, if, let's say, you have some kind of value that you pass in the query object, and that value doesn't match any of the properties that you have in your schema, now it's not going to throw basically an error, in a sense that it's not going to return no jobs. Instead, it's going to return all jobs. So hopefully that is clear. When we were working on the Store API project, we worked with Mongoose version 5. And in that case, if, let's say, you're setting something here in the query object that doesn't match any properties in your model, then again, you got back 0 jobs. In this case, it just ignores it. So in version 6, we get all of the jobs. Now, that doesn't affect our functionality. I still like this mental model where we set up the query object and then we optionally pass in the properties. But I just wanted to mention that, again, there are some changes in version 6. And with this in place, I think we'll start with the search input. And let's just start by navigating to the jobs controller. And we're looking for get all jobs controller. So in the controllers folder, we're looking for jobs and then more specifically get all jobs. And let's start with the simple console log where we want to go with rec and query. Now, I'm not going to log the user. Hopefully it is clear that yes, it is a protected route. And of course we have rec.user and user ID. Let's save it. I'm going to navigate back. I suggest adding, of course, some values already in the search, because if you won't, then search is also not going to get added to the query params. So let me type some gibberish. So now I have SDD, and now notice this is my request with all of the key value pairs in the query params. And if we navigate back, check it out. So now status is equal to interview, job type all, sort latest, and page is equal to 1. And of course I have the search. So we can clearly see that we're getting the values from the front end. So now let's start setting up the logic. And the first thing I want to do is pull out all of the values. Now, of course, you can do one by one, but I already know what values are we going to be getting. So I'm going to go with search status, job type, and then also I want to go with sort, and all of that is equal to a rec.query. Now, if you're wondering why we're not pulling out the page, we covered that when we learned the pagination in the Store API project. So essentially, we will use it, but we'll go directly with rec query and then the page. Then let's set up that object. So in here, let's say query object. And that one is equal to an object. And then let's start here by setting up the property created by. Again, all of these properties will match whatever we have in the model. Otherwise, the functionality is not going to work. Basically, you'll just get all the jobs. And that one will be equal to rec user, and then ID. Then, like I said, since we will chain some things after we perform this query, we actually don't want to go with await. So I'll remove await over here. I'll say job find, and we'll set up the query object, and also remove the sort, since again this will be chained after that. And instead of jobs, it's going to be let, and we're just going to go with a result. So let's remove this jobs as well. Go with jobs find, and now let's go with const jobs and await, wait, and then result. And like I keep saying, there's going to be logic in between. So get the result, but we'll change some things to the result, and that's why we only run await here later. Now at the moment, of course, it doesn't make sense. You're like, well, why we just don't stick await? Well, because it's going to be more logic in between. So we get the jobs. Now we won't send back the count. Actually, we'll send back total jobs and number of pages. But for now, let's just remove the count. And since we're already on a roll, why don't we set up the logic for search? So right after the query object, I'm going to say if search exists. So if there's some kind of value in that input, because like I keep saying, if let's say I have nothing here, then the search is not going to be in query params. So in that case, I don't want to add it to this object. But if it does exist, so let's add, I don't know, DA, for example. Then what I want to do is to set up query object, then position. Can you switch it to company? Of course you can, but in my case, I won't. And since I basically want to have a better search, I'm going to use a regex. So I'm going to go here with this operator. I'll say regex. Now that one is equal to my search. And then we want to go with options as well. Options, and we'll set it equal to I. Once we save, what you'll notice that now I'll be able to perform a proper search. So let's say if I go with DAM, now I'm going to have no jobs to display. However, if I go back to DA, notice now I have database administrator, and we're looking for that position. So let me remove and just go with D, and now you'll notice that we're getting back all the jobs where in the position there is AD. And if you get the same result, we can move on to status and the job type. Okay, and up next, let's work on the status input as well as the type one. And like I already mentioned previously, when it comes to all, essentially what I'm saying is that regardless of the status value, get me the jobs. So in that case, we'll get all of the statuses, but then once we start providing these values, then of course we'll only get the jobs, for example, where the status is equal to an interview. And as far as the logic, it's going to look like this, where we have pulled out the values, or at least I have, and I'm going to check whether the status exists and if it's not equal to all. So if it's equal to all, then I'm not going to pass it. I'm just going to get all the jobs. Now, if both conditions are met, then we're going to go with query object dot status is equal to status. So whatever is this value, again, in the case of status, it's going to be interview declined. And what was the first one? Interview declined, then pending. And the same thing goes for job type. And again, where we're getting rest of the values, after all, it's coming directly from the job model. I know I have probably mentioned this like 10 times by now, but I think it's a very important point that I need to just keep hammering home. So let's just set up that logic where in the jobs, in my case, I'm going to go right after search, and I'm just going to go with if status exists, and if it's not equal to all. And let's go with AND operator. I'll just say status is not equal to all. Then, of course, let's add it to our query object. Then let's go with query object. Let's go with that status. That was equal to a status. And effectively, we can just copy and paste. And we can do the same thing for the job type. So in here, let's just select all the places where we have statuses. And let's go with job tab. Let's save it. And now if we navigate back, now in my case, I'm going to remove that D, but please keep in mind that yes, of course, now all of the filters are working. And you know what, let me remove this one just so we have a clean slate. So now let's start here with interview. And you'll notice that I'm getting only the jobs where the status is equal to interview. Can we combine? Yes, of course. So in this case, I'm going to go with full-time. And that's the beauty of basically adding data, adding some fake data to the database. Because otherwise you're just, running around like a headless chicken and then adding those jobs, manually one by one. I think it's much nicer if we have more jobs, and it's pretty easy to set up with the macro and the populate function that we set up. So of course we can also add the search. Let's say I'm going to look for jobs where there is letters TE. So now we have this one, and I also have it over here. So associate professor. And with this in place, we're done with the first 3 inputs. And up next, we'll set up the sort. Beautiful. And before we worry about the pagination, let's also knock out the sort. And effectively, we just want to chain it. So in between the await and eventually pagination, we also want to chain dot sort. And here we just need to remember that if we go with this minus, then it's going to be descending. And then if we don't have it, by default, it's going to be ascending. So for example, if there's a value of latest, then we look for created at property and we go with minus. And what that means is that we'll display the most recent jobs we have applied to. However, if we go with oldest from the front end, then we go with created at. So the same property. However, in this case, we go with ascending. And the same works with A to Z and Z to A. So these are the values, the possible values that are going to be coming from the front end. Now, $1,000,000 question. Can you name them on the front end differently? And let's say add more. Absolutely. Of course. This is just something that I come up with for this particular project. And of course, I'm talking about the front end part right now. So let's navigate again to our favorite controller, get all jobs. And now let's just chain that. So again, we're going to go after result and before await, because once we await, we're not going to be able to chain it anymore. And here, let's just check for the value of sort. And I believe the default one is the latest over here. So essentially, that's the front end setup that it's always going to start with a latest. So let's go here. Let's say result. And then that one is equal to result.sort. And like I said, we go with negative over here. Created that. That's the property. And essentially, we're getting the values in descending order. And keep in mind something that I mentioned already in the store API project, that when it comes to a sorting, we're not limiting the amount of jobs we get. We are essentially just structuring our response. So the previous ones, yes, they were actually limiting the amount of items that we have in the response. Now, possibly limiting. Of course, if they return all jobs, they return all jobs, but possibly they return less jobs back from the database. However, in this case, we're just changing the order. So now let me grab all this 1, 2, and then 3. And now we just want to change these values. So in here, we're going to go with oldest. And we'll just remove. So now this will be ascending. And then we'll go with A to Z. And in this case, I'm looking for a different property. I'm looking for the position property. And then, of course, I can also do position. However, in this case, it's going to be negative. Again, this one will be the descending one. So in this case, we're looking for Z Z2A. Now let's test it out. Let's save it. And we can leave the values here. In my case, I think I'm going to remove it simply because I want to get more jobs. So in here, if you go with latest, you'll notice actually that this is August 3rd. And then if we keep on scrolling, then we have, for example, July 4th and then June 16th. So as you can see, the most recent job shows up first. Now you can probably already guess that if you're going to go here with the oldest one, then this is going to be, let's say, August 13, 2021, and then 23rd, 25th, and hopefully you see where I'm going with this. Now, if we go A to Z, then as far as the position, it's going to go A to Z, and then if we go Z to A, then we get back the jobs in the opposite order. And with this in place, we're done with the inputs, and now let's worry about the pagination. Okay, and the last thing as far as the all jobs is to set up a pagination. And let's quickly cover again the main reason why we want to do that. Essentially, yes, you can set up the pagination on the front end, but that does not change the fact of how many jobs or how much data in general gets sent over the wire. So in this case, the test user has 75 jobs, correct? But imagine if you have tons of users and tons of data. So you have 1,000 users with 1,000 jobs each, as an example. Then handling that on the front end is probably not the best choice. Can you do it? Yes. You can basically request all the jobs and then you can handle that on the front end, but it will definitely make your front end slower. And those things can add up quickly. Server is much better equipped to handle that. So effectively, instead of sending back, in this case, 75 jobs, we will limit the jobs that we're sending back. And then if the user wants to see page number 2, 3, or whatever, then of course he or she can do that. But again, the main idea is that we're limiting the amount of items we're sending over the wire. And also, server is better at handling that logic when it comes to the database. So instead of getting all the jobs over the wire and then setting up the pagination on the front end, we're going to have the query, we're going to get back to jobs, and then we'll use limit and skip to basically return page by page. And if we take a look at the README, it's going to look something like this. Now, I'm not going to spend too much time on this because, again, we did cover it step by step in the store project. But essentially, we want to go with number because page is a string since it's in the rec.query. So first, we want to set up the number. And that's the reason why we were not pulling out of the rec.query at the top, because I simply want to go with the same name here. We pass it in the number, and then we say if it's not provided, it's going to be equal to 1. So we'll always start with page number 1. Then this is not coming from the front end, but you can definitely add that functionality. We are looking for a limit, and by default, we're just going to set it equal to 10. So each page is going to return 10 jobs. And then we'll just set up the skip variable, which is going to be equal page minus 1 times the limit. And then again, we'll just chain it to result.skip. We'll pass in the skip. So that's how we'll get to page 2, 3, and whatever. And we'll also pass in the limit. So that's going to be the amount of jobs. Again, if you need a refresher, please go back to the store project where we covered that in greater detail. And then in this project, I also want to add total jobs and number of pages. And if you're wondering, well, can we set up different variable names? Yes, of course. But this is pretty typical where you go with total jobs. So the front end knows, hey, how many jobs are there total for this particular query? Again, please keep in mind, we're talking about this particular query. And then also, well, how many pages there total. And of course, I will swing back to the front end and showcase where you can find each of these values. So first, let's start by setting up the pagination. So I'm going to navigate back to jobs, and then right after the sort, we want to go here with const page, const limit, and skip, and we want to chain it to the result. And then we'll get back the jobs. Again, the idea is that instead of sending back whatever amount of jobs we're sending, let's say 75, we're only going to send back 10 because we'll have limit of 10 per page. So let's start here. So const page is equal to number. We pass in rec query, then dot page. If it's not provided, it's going to be equal to 1. So we'll start with 1. Let's copy and paste. The second value will be limit. In this case, I'll say rec.query.limit, but I can tell you right away that it's not coming from the front end. But yes, you can add that functionality on a front end. So you can clearly showcase that the user can change the limit of items per page. And by default, we're going to go with 10. So if it's not provided, we're going to go with 10. And then lastly, we're looking for the skip one. And skip is going to be equal to a simple logic where we're going to go with page minus 1 times the limit. So that's how we can get to the pages 2, 3, and hopefully you see where I'm going with this. So first, let's go with result is equal to, and now we'll go with result.skip. So how many items we need to skip. This is what we calculate over here. And then also we'll set up the limit right away. And that one will be equal to our limit value. And once we save, you'll notice that by default, let's say if we don't have any searches, we should get back 10 jobs. Now, if you want to count that, please do. But I can guarantee you that now, of course, we're sending back 10 jobs. Now, if I'll change this around, and if I'll, let's say, I don't know, 5, for example, then of course now I'll have 5 jobs. I just need to go back here, refresh, and now we have only 5 jobs. So that's the limit. Now, the next thing is the total jobs as well as number of pages. So yes, there is a pagination set up on the front end, but it's looking for 2 things. It's looking for the total jobs as well as number of pages. And then once we provide those values, there's actually going to be a nice pagination on the front end. Now, in order to get that, we need to run one more time await. So we want to go with job. So again, this is a model. And then we have a special method, count documents. And in that count documents, we provide the same thing. We provide the same query object. So again, this is going to return not the total jobs for the user. It's actually going to return the total jobs based on the query. And then we'll calculate, well, how many pages we have for that query. So we'll take total jobs for the query divided by the limit. So let's say the query returns 25 jobs. If the limit is 10, that means that we'll divide total jobs 25 divided by 10. Now we do want to round this up because I don't want to display 2.5 pages. I want to display 3 pages. So first 2 pages are going to have 10 jobs because that is my limit. And then the third one is going to have the remaining jobs, which if we have 25 is going to be equal to 5 jobs. So let's set this one up. I'm going to go to jobs controller, and then right after result, we'll set up another await. We're going to go here with const total jobs is equal to await, again, job model, then special method count documents. We want to provide the same query object. And next, let's calculate number of pages. So num of pages, and yes, the values that we set up over here need to be exact, because that is what the front end is expecting. But of course, if you build your own front end, and if you come up with different values on a front end, then on the server, they will also be different. So let's go here with math dot and then ceiling. Let's pass in total jobs for the query divided by the limit. And now, right after the jobs, we want to just pass them. So total jobs, comma, and then num of pages. So let's save this. And first, we'll just notice that since we have 75 jobs for the test user, again, notice we don't have any searches. And that's the amount of jobs we added when we set up the populate. And now if we keep on scrolling, notice now we have 8 pages. And of course, we have the pagination functionality on the front end. And if we take a look at the network, now notice how we're changing this value in the rec.query. So basically now we're sending a request and we say, okay, get me page 3, get me page 6, and lastly, let me get the page number 8. So that's how we can set up the filter, sort, and pagination on the server. And as a result, our all jobs page is complete. Okay, and up next, instead of working on the stats page, we're actually going to work on a test user and the API limiter. Because when it comes to the stats, it's probably, at least in my opinion, going to be the most complex functionality on a server. And I just want to save the best for the last. So first, let's go to a complete project and let me show you what we're going to be working on right now. So now I want to restrict certain actions for the test user. So having a demo user is nice, but I don't want that user to update the profile, the job, edit the job, and delete the job. Because, I mean, internet is a weird thing where you know what I'm talking about. I mean, I don't need to go into details. So we'll restrict these actions for a test user. So test user can only come here and take a look at the final application. So take a look at the jobs, perform the filtering, take a look at the stats and all that. But he or she cannot perform any CRUD operations. And the way we'll do that, essentially, there's multiple ways, but I'm going to go with this approach where, remember, we have authentication middleware, correct? Now, what do we do over there? We verify the token. And what do we have in a token? We have the ID, and we also have the name. Now, if you want, you can place an email instead of name, and you can check for the test user email. But in my case, I'm going to test for the ID. So from the MongoDB, I'm going to grab the ID of my test user, and I'll say, look, if the payload dot user ID is equal to whatever value is here, then it's a test user. And after that, I'm going to add that test user property with the value that I have there, basically true or false, in the rec.user. And once that is ready to go, we'll set up another middleware where we'll check if the test user is true. Then we'll send back the bad request, test user, read only. And then we'll just go to the route that we want to restrict and add that test user. And the end result is going to look like this, where basically if the user tries to update some data, we get back test user, read only. Hopefully this is clear. So now let's start by checking the user ID. Again, if you want to check for the email, you just need to go to the model, since that's where we're adding this. And then instead of name, you can just add email. In my case, I will leave the name. so I'm not going to change that, but I'll check for the ID in the authentication middleware. Now, the first thing probably that I need to do is go to the MongoDB, and I want to get that ID of the test user. So notice over here, I have these values. And just to showcase that at the moment we can still update, let me change this to a demo user. The last name, let me take a look what I have here, Shake and Bake. Shake and Bake, and the location is going to be a vegan food truck. So let's save this. Yep, user updated, awesome. And now let me navigate to my auth middleware, where it is. So we're here, and then, no, not the error handler, sorry. So I want to go over here, and notice we are using JW to verify. And in the payload, of course, we have whatever we stick in the JWT. So now let's create that test user. So test user is equal to payload, and then user ID. And if that one is equal to, and now let me pass in, and of course now I assigned it. That's not what I wanted to do. So let me remove the parentheses over here. And technically we're adding this name. I mean, I don't think there's any need here. So let me remove it, and let me just go with test user. And essentially, let me just showcase that in any of the authenticated routes, we can check for rec.user, and there's going to be a test user, true or false. Now, which one I'm going to check? I think the update one. So let me go to over here. Auth. Let's keep moving. Update user, and then before or after rec.body, doesn't really matter. You can go with log and then rec.user. Now let's test it out. Where basically, if I try to send a request here, demo, and then save changes in here somewhere, yep, I have test user is equal to true. Now, if we log out, and then if I log in with John, hopefully I remember the password. Otherwise, you'll have to watch me struggle. Yep, everything's fine. If I go to profile and then let's say John Smith, of course, the value in this case, it's going to be false. So now we can clearly see that the first one was a test user and the second one is not a test user. So now let me go back, log out. And now if I go back to the login, and if I go with demo app, I log in as a test user. All right, and once we have successfully added the test user property on the rec.user, now I want to set up a separate middleware, the test user middleware. In there, we will import bad request. We'll check if the test user is true, then we send back bad request. If not, then we just pass it on to the next middleware, which is going to be our controller. And effectively, then we just need to decide where we want to place it. So in my case, I will restrict the update user route. I'll add test user. And also for the jobs, I'll restrict create job. I still want the test user to get all jobs, as well as the stats that we're going to work on later. But I do want to restrict the delete job and update job. So update user, and then create job, delete job, and update job. And I guess let's start by setting up the middleware. Let's say test user.js. In there first, we want to get the bad request. So bad request coming from the errors. So require. And then in there, we're looking for the errors folder. So 2 levels up, or sorry, 1 level up. We're looking for the errors. That's going to get the index. And you know what? It's not just bad request. It actually should be here. Error. And then let's set up that middleware quickly. So test user is equal to rec res and then next if the value is true. So if rec user, and again, This is going to be for authenticated routes. So we'll always get direct user. Then we're looking for test user. And if that's the case, we want to throw the bad request. So new bad request error, and let's pass in some message. So in my case, I'm going to go with test user and then read. So that's what we're going to display in the alert on the front end. And then let's pass in the next. Now, of course, we want to export that. So we'll go with module exports, and that was equal to a test user. And we want to import in our route. So let's go to auth first. And we want to look for the test user one. So in this case, I can copy and paste. And we just need to change these values around. So I'm going to go here with test user. For some reason, messed up over here. So let me start from scratch. So test user. And then, like I said, where we have the update user, let's also stick the test user. So test user, and now let's try it out. So now let me go to my front end. And if we try to send a request, we're going to get back test user read only. So now, once we know that everything works, we can just navigate to the jobs routes and also add the same functionality over there. So let me open up the jobs, and you know what, in this case, I think I'm just gonna import the test user here back in the jobs. And we want to add that, like I said, to create job. So let's add a comma here for test user. Then we want to delete the job and update the job as well. So test user here and test user to delete the job, or I'm sorry, update the job. So now let me try it out on front end, where I'm going to type some gibberish, submit. Nope. Test user only. Okay, all jobs should have the 75. Let's try to delete. Nope, test user only. And the same goes if we're trying to edit. Same deal, test user only. Beautiful. And now let's work on the API limiter. Okay, and once we're done with the test user, now let's limit the amount of times that the user can log in or register. Basically, we just want to avoid somebody who's trying to spam our application. Now, if you remember the jobs API, we set up the API limiter to our entire application. And like I just said, in this case, we'll add that for 2 requests, just so you're aware of this approach as well. And effectively, we just want to grab this package, since it's still in the package.json. We don't need to do anything. We don't need to install it. We just go with whatever name. And we're looking for express rate limit. And then we set up here the function again. We go with rate limiter, we invoke it, and then we pass in the object. So in how long, how many requests, and also in this case, I set up the message as an object because that is what the front end is expecting. So if you remember previously, we just set up the string. In this case, I set up the object with the message property. Again, the reason for that is because the front end is looking for that. And then I inject that before the register and the login. So again, the biggest difference is that previously we limited the access for our entire application. In this case, is just for these 2 routes, the register and login, just so you are aware of this approach as well. And effectively, we just want to go to the routes folder. We're looking for the auth, and then right after the test middleware, we want to grab the package. So let me go with const here, and then I'll call this rate limiter. Now that will be equal to require, and we're looking for the package. So it's express rate limit. And then let's invoke it. Let's say const API limiter, or whatever name you prefer. And then it's going to be a rate limiter. We invoke it, and then we pass in the object. So I'm going to go with window milliseconds. So basically, it's the time limit. So window and then ms. Again, that is according to their documentation. And we go with 15 times 60 times 1000. Effectively, that is 15 minutes, then comma, then max. Now I'm going to set it up as 1 first, just so we can right away test it, just so we can see how it works. And then let's go with that message that the front end is expecting. Or we're going to go here with MSG property. And then let's just write too many requests from this API. Please try again after 15 minutes. And once we have this one in place, let's just scroll down, and where we have the register and the login, let's just add this extra middleware here, as well as for the login. And now let's test it out. I'm going to navigate to my front end, log out, and then I believe I can use the demo one. That also should work. So we have welcome demo app, and now let me log out, and I should have the issue. Notice, now I have too many requests from this API. Please try again after 15 minutes. Now, of course, the reason for that is because I have max of 1, just to showcase how that works. Realistically, we're going to go with, let's say, 10. And the last thing we need to do, according to their docs, we need to go with this app.set trust proxy and then pass in 1. And that is because eventually we will push this up to Heroku. So let me just copy this line of code. Now this doesn't change, by the way, from the previous project. It was the same setup. Let me go back to app.js and let me just add it in front of all the middleware. So now, of course, I have app.set and then this value. And with this in place, we're done setting up the API limiter for our 2 requests, the register as well as the login. Okay, and up next, let's work on the stats page. And like I already mentioned previously, this probably is going to be the hardest thing in this project, just because we're going to utilize MongoDB aggregation pipeline. And effectively, if my explanations are not good enough, I strongly suggest just utilizing your search engine, look for MongoDB aggregation pipeline. You can definitely utilize the docs, and also there are some useful blog posts as well as videos. Now, effectively, the idea is following that. We have our data, correct? And I just want to group this data based on something. So in our case, now let me quickly navigate to a complete project just to showcase. I want to group by the status. So remember, we have the status and we have these 3 options. We have interview, declined, and pending. So in the stats page, I want to send back the response where I group how many applications are pending, how many interviews, and then how many jobs have been declined. Now also, I want to send out how many applications we filled out in the last 6 months. Now for both of them, like I said, we're going to use the aggregation pipeline. I think a docs is a great way to start, where effectively they say aggregation pipeline consists of 1 or more stages that process the documents. Again, in our case, those are the jobs. And each stage performs an operation on the input documents. For example, a stage can filter documents, group documents, and calculate the values. The documents that are output from the stage are passed to the next stage. So essentially, we pass the documents from one stage to another one, and the ones that arrive in the previous stage are essentially the starting point in the next stage. Aggregation pipeline can return results from groups of documents, for example, return the total, average, maximum, and minimum values. And I really like their example. It's very basic, but pretty much covers all the bases. So essentially, they just insert some data. Looks like pizzas, and then there's a name for the pizza, the size, price, and the quantity. And as you can see, the values are changing here when it comes to size, when it comes to name, as well as the price and quantity. And then in order to set up the aggregation pipeline, we need to go with aggregate. So that's the syntax. Then we invoke it, and then we pass in the array. And in that array, each step is going to be represented with this object. And yes, there are special operators that we use. And first one is going to be the match stage, where we'll match the documents based on something. Now, in our case, that is going to be the user ID. Because again, when we're talking about the stats, talking about the stats for the specific user, not just all the jobs, but I want to get specific applications that belong to a user, the user that is currently logged in. Hopefully that is clear. Now, in their case, they go by size. So if you take a look at their data, notice, so size is changing, and they just get all the pizzas that have a size of medium. Now, after that, there's a grouping stage. So first we got all the pizzas where the size is medium. And second, I want to group them based on name, and I want to get the total quantity. And here they use another operator, which is going to be a sum. And if we want to access a specific property here, let's say in our original data, as you can see, we need to go with $sign and then the name of the property. So this is the special syntax, where this is a special operator, the sum one. And yes, there are multiple operators. And the best way pretty much to find out which operator you can use is by just utilizing your search engine and the documentation. There's really no secret answer there. Yes, you will just have to do some research if you want to perform a different operation. And it also goes the same for the stages we're going to set up in our upcoming videos. I utilize the docs, and then I just discovered what are the ways how we can use those operators. So this is a special operator to sum up the items, and then when it comes to a properties from the original data, we need to go with $sign and then the name of the property. And as you can see here, the result is that we get all the pizzas where the size is medium, and we get the name of the pizza, and we also get the total quantity. And of course, you can scroll up and you can double check, and you'll see that both of them match. So hopefully this introduction is comprehensive enough. And now let's proceed and start setting up our own aggregation pipeline in our project. And like always, let's start with the front end. So first, let's check what route the front end is trying to hit. And if I open up the network tab and if we refresh, we'll notice that the front end is looking for the stats route, which is under jobs. And of course, at the moment, we're getting back 404. Why? Well, because we haven't created that route, correct? So let's start with that. First, I want to go to the jobs controller, and I want to create a show stats controller. Rec and res, we can of course set up the async and all that. And then we want to go with res.status, and we'll send back 200. And when it comes to response, front end is going to be looking for two things. For the default stats property, which is going to be an object. Now, of course, eventually there will be values. But for now, we'll just send back empty object. And also a monthly applications, which will be an array. At the moment, empty array, but of course, yes, there will be data. And again, both of the properties need to match exactly. Otherwise, the front end is not going to know what to do. And once we have this controller, we want to export that. And then in the routes /jobs, we want to get the show stats, and we want to set up the stats route. And then we'll start working on the functionality. So let's start here in the controllers. We want to go to jobs first. And I have get all jobs, and let's keep on scrolling. I guess right before the exports, we want to go with const show stats. Now, I don't remember whether we need async, but for now, let's just use it anyway. So rec and res, and then let's set up the functionality. And first, I guess, let's start by setting up the response. So res, then status, then let's pass in the status codes. We'll say, okay, Like I said, we're going to go here with JSON, and we'll pass in the object. We'll say default stats. That will be equal to an empty object for now. And then we also want to go with monthly applications. And then that one will be equal to an empty array. Let's export the show stats controller. And then back in the routes, we want to import that first. So show stats, and right above the /ID, we're going to go here with router.route, and we'll pass in the stats. Then we're going to go with .get, and let's go with show stats. Now, once we save it and we navigate back to the front end, and once we refresh, we'll see stats 200. So at least the route exists. Yes, there's no functionality as of yet. Don't worry. We're going to set that all up in the following videos. Okay, and once we have the controller in place, now let's start setting up the logic. And the first thing we want to do is to install moment library, which is something that we're going to use later, but we might as well do that right now. And then we want to import the Mongoose package and moment package in the jobs controller. So let's stop the server. In my case, I'm going to clear it. We want to go with install moment. And yes, of course, I'll talk about this library later once we actually start using it. And as a side note, it's not install moment. It should be npm install. In your README, of course, everything is going to be correct. So let me go with npm install, or I, if you want to save a little bit on typing, and then we install the package. So that's done. Then again, let's go with npm run and then dev. And now we want to import the Mongoose as well as the moment library in the jobs controller. So let me save here. Let me scroll up and let's go with const. Mongoose is equal to require. And then we're looking for the Mongoose library, and the same thing with the moment. So const moment is equal to require. And then we want to go with a moment library. Then let's keep on moving. And now let's set up our first aggregation pipeline. And the way it's going to look like is following. So first we're going to go with let stats, because we'll have to do some manual labor a little bit later. And essentially we'll modify the existing data. So therefore we want to go with let. So we need to go with let stats equals to await, and then job, so the job model, and then we call aggregate method. So by doing so, we're setting up that aggregation pipeline. Then, like I said, we need to pass in the array, and we need to set up these stages. So first one is going to be the match stage, where from all the jobs we match documents that belong to the specific user. And that specific user, of course, is found with the user ID. So each request again comes in, it is authenticated, and we get that user ID. Now, why do we need to use here Mongoose, then types, and then object ID? Well, because this user ID is a string, but we want it to be that Mongoose object. So that's why we need to get the Mongoose package, then run types, and then object ID, and then pass in the user ID. So this is going to get the jobs that belong to a user. Now, in our case, at least in my case, that is going to be the demo user. Since demo user has those 70 jobs. And then we want to group them. We want to group them by status, because this is going to get us pretty much all the jobs, correct? And then I want to group based on the status. So that will be my ID. And then I want to count how many I have pending, interviews, and jobs declined. And in order to do that, I'm going to set up the property. Now, property name is really up to you, but I went with count. And then again, we need to use special operator, sum, and set it equal to 1. Where did I find that info? Again, search engine, documentation, blog posts. So again, let me repeat. If you're looking for some other functionality, those are the steps that you'll need to take. And in my case, what I'm going to do is log what we get back. And then in the next video, we will refactor our data a little bit. So let's start right now in the jobs where, yes, we'll still send back this data, but of course we want to set up those stats. So let's go with let stats is equal to await, then job, and then aggregate method. We pass in the array, and let's set up those steps. So first one will be a match one, and yes, this is a special operator. So we go with $, and then match. And in here, first we'll look for created by property, and we'll set it equal to that user ID. Again, this is going to get me all the jobs that belong to the user who's currently logged in. And we need to do this whole song and dance with mongoose types object ID, simply because the user ID is a string already at this point, and it needs to be a mongoose object. So let's go here with user ID. So that's the first stage. Then after that, we want to set up the group stage. So let me add a comment, otherwise I have the error here. Let's go $, group, and then in here, again, the property names are technically up to you. So in my case, I'm going to go with _ID, and then I'll look for the status property. Now, if you want to group that data based on something else, of course you can do that. You just need to change the property. Now, in my case, since I want to display the applications based on a status, that's why I'm using the status property. And yes, the syntax is following. We go with string, so the quotation marks, then the $, and then the property name. The property name in our model. Very important. And then I want to set up the count property, which is going to count how many jobs have the status of interview, pending, as well as the declined. So we're going to go with count, then we'll set it equal to an object, and we'll go with $, sum equals to 1. Now what I want to do is just log the stats so you can see. So let's go here with stats. I'll go back to my front end, and then again, we just need to refresh. On the front end, nothing is going to change, but we'll nicely see that we have an array with _ID. So again, you can change this property around. And this is just going to say what is the value for the status. And then I'll get the exact count. And if you see the same data, congratulations, we're done with the first step in getting our stats data. Not bad, not bad. We used aggregate pipeline to get our array of objects. And in there we have the status value as well as the count. But the problem is that the front end is looking for a different structure. Basically, the front end wants to get an object where these status values are properties, and then the value is going to be equal to a count. Now, $1 million question. Can you set up that refactor on the front end? Yes, absolutely. But in this project, I decided that I'm going to refactor on the backend, and then the front end gets the exact data that it's looking for. Now, in order to refactor data, I'll use a reduce method. And if you're not familiar with reduce or how reduce works with objects, then please utilize these two JavaScript Nuggets videos where I cover that in the vanilla JavaScript setup, and I go step by step. So in here, I am assuming that you know how the reduce works, so we're not going to spend too much time on it. Effectively, I want to iterate over this array, and I want to pull out the ID property. I'll call it title, and I'll also pull out the count property from the current item. And then in this line, for every value, we create that property. So it's going to be either decline, interview, or pending, and we set it equal to a count. And as a result, again, we're going to get back the object. So let's try this one out. I'm going to navigate back to the jobs. Now I'll still log them just so you can see what's happening. But now let's refactor our data. And that's why, again, we use let, so we can easily do that. I'll set equal to stats dot reduce. Now remember, for reduce, we want to pass in the callback function, and we also want to say what we want to return from the reduce. So in this case, it's going to be an object. Then we go with accumulator as well as the current. Now, of course, these are parameter names. You can change them, but basically this reflects what we're returning. In this case, again, it's an object, and current returns the current item in the array. So it's going to be the first one, second one, and the third one. Like I said, we want to pull out the ID, and I'm going to set it right away equal to a title. So I'm just giving it an alias. And then I also want to pull out the count, and that will be equal to a current. Now, how do I know that? Well, because I can clearly see what properties my objects have. And then let's set up a property in the object that we're returning. So I'm going to go with accumulator. So now I'm referencing the object that I'm returning, and I'm just going to go title. So this is going to be dynamic. It's either going to be decline, interview, or pending, and I'll set it equal to a count. Now, one big gotcha with reduce, we always want to return the accumulator. Otherwise, it's not going to make sense. So now let me save this. Now let me go back to my front end. Again, let me make a request. In here, nothing is going to change. But now, if I log it, I can see that I nicely return a object with these values. Now, the last thing that I want to do, as far as the stats, is actually set up the default stats. Because everything works nice if we have already a bunch of jobs. But let's take a look at what happens if, let's say, we log in with a user that hasn't created any jobs. So let me just set up a new user. I'm going to go here with register. I'm going to call this Susan. Hopefully, I don't have her in the database. So susan@gmail.com. And then let's set up some kind of password. Let's submit. Okay. We successfully log in. In here, we can see that, yeah, we have all the zeros. But if we take a look at our console, we'll actually see this empty object. Now, the reason why nothing breaks on the front end, because there is already check for such thing. And if there are no values, then basically we pass in the zeros. But just like with inputs when we work with forms, it's a good practice to set up those checks on the front end as well as the back end, because that way you're avoiding unnecessary bugs. So in here, I'm going to set up a new object, technically a new object. Please remember that we are returning exactly the same property from the response. So this is just going to match what we have in the response. So technically, if you don't want to set up the new object, you can pass these values directly where we're returning the default stats. But in my case, I'm going to set up a new object. And essentially, here's what I'm saying. There's going to be an object with these three properties, pending, interview, and decline. And if in that object there is no such property, then I'm just returning 0. So I'm just setting up some default values, aka that's why I call this default stats. Again, there is already check on the front end. I already set it up, but this is just a double precaution. So let me go back to the jobs, and then instead of log, I'm just going to go here with the default stats. So const default stats is equal to an object, and then one by one, let's set up those properties. So pending is equal to a stats pending or a 0, like we have with Susan, and the same thing is going to be for the rest of them. So one by one, let's copy and paste. We just want to change these values around. So the second one is not going to be pending. It's actually going to be interview. And then we have the third one, which is going to be equal to declined. Declined, like so. Let's save that. And now we just need to essentially change this from the empty object to our actual object, the default stats. And now, of course, I will go back. And Susan doesn't have any jobs. And if you want to create a job with whatever user you just created, you can definitely do so. In my case, I think it's going to be faster if I go to demo app, and if I'll log in with the demo user, and if everything's correct, you should see the values for the pending, for interviews, as well as jobs declined. Awesome. We're done with the default stats, or the stats. And now let's worry about the monthly applications. So this is something that we're going to be sending back to the front end. And notice here we have a chart library. And I'll probably mention this 20,000 times during the setup. But the reason why our data is going to have a specific structure is because the front end, and more specifically, this charts library. So similarly, how we refactored the original stats data to an object, because that's what the front end was expecting. Same goes here. Yes, you can technically send it back everything to the front end as it is after your pipeline, after the aggregation pipeline. And you can definitely set up the logic on the front end. But in my case, I decided to do that on the back end. So the front end is just getting the data in a format that makes the most sense. Now, I can also right away say that this aggregation pipeline is going to be more complex because we're dealing with the dates. So there's going to be more acrobatics involved. Effectively, we just want to set up a variable. In my case, I'm going to go by name monthly applications. Again, we want to run job and aggregate, so we set up the pipeline. The first step is exactly the same, match, and we're looking for the specific user ID. So most likely I'll just copy this, since that way we can save a little bit of time. And next one is a grouping stage. So again, I'll set up some kind of variable, in my case underscore ID, and in here I'll group based on two properties. So remember, we have a year and a month. And what's really cool with MongoDB, that we can actually get the year from created at, which obviously is awesome. It really makes our life that much simpler. However, keep in mind, since we're getting back, let's say, a month of December, which I believe is 11, there's a difference whether that month 11 is in 2022 or it's 2020. So therefore, when we're grouping, I actually want to group based on two conditions, the year and the month. And then I want to sum up, well, how many applications I sent out in that particular month. So in here, notice this is December 2021. And then we also have August 2021 because we're displaying the last 6 months again. The reason why we're doing that, because if you just go with month, then the data is not going to be correct. You might have multiple years. Then we want to sort because we want to display the last 6 months. And this is the case where we add one more step. The step is going to be sort. And essentially, I'm just going to say that underscore ID year minus 1 over here, because this is going to be an object. And the same goes here, the minus 1. And if you remember, when we add that minus, then we go descending. So essentially, we'll display the last month first, correct? And then at the very end, we have another step, which is limit 6. Again, more complicated because we're dealing with the dates. And then we'll do, again, a little bit of magic because front end is expecting data in a certain format. So let's start working on this, where in the jobs, I want to go, I guess, past the default stats. And then we want to go and set up the pipeline. Like I said, I'll copy and paste this just so we can speed this up a little bit. So it's not going to be a stats. We're going to go with monthly and applications. Then the first step is exactly the same. We want to match all of them. And then we'll group based on the year and a month. So let's set up the $. Let's go with group. And then we'll set it equal to an object. And in there we'll have two things. We'll have underscore ID, which is going to be equal to two properties. First one year, second one month, like so. Now both of them will actually be equal to this object. And then we need to go with year. And we want to go with created at. Created and then at. So this is going to get the year. And then we'll get the month. And now let's do the same thing here. Copy and paste. We just want to change the operator around. So notice this is going to get the year, and this is actually going to get the month, which again is really awesome that basically we can pull out those values from created at. We don't need to do any more acrobatics. And then let's just go with count, and we're going to go with sum and then 1. So now effectively we're counting. And before we do anything, let's just run that. Let's just say log and then monthly applications. And this is something that I always suggest doing. Log it, because that way you'll have a better understanding what you're getting back. So let me go here. Let me refresh. Monthly applications is not defined, and it looks like the bug is the missing letter. So let me try one more time. Let me refresh. Okay, I have the applications. And now you'll notice that these are all the values that we're getting back. So we have year, we have month, and then we have count. So how many? And like I said, we're grouping them together. So the month number 9 is different for the 2021 than it is for 2022. Hopefully this makes sense. So now, of course, we just want to sort them, because like I said, I want to start with descending. Notice I have 2022, and then I have 2021, and then again I have 2022. So I only want to get the last 6 months. How do we do that? Well, we add one more step over here. So right after the group, we're going to go here with sort, and then we want to look for the ID year. Again, this is the property name. And then since it's an object, I'm looking for the year. So let me go underscore ID dot and then year. And let me set it equal to -1. And the same thing I want to do with a month. So sort, and then let's add a comma. And let's just change this around to a month. So let's go with ID and then month. Let's save that. And again, let's run it one more time. Let's refresh. And now, of course, I'm getting them in the descending order. So this is 2022 month, and then notice how the values go from the higher to a lower. And lastly, we want to add that step where we limit. So we're going to go here and we'll say limit, and we'll set it equal to 6. If you want more months, of course, you can change the value over here. Last time, let's refresh from the front end. And then, of course, we'll get only last 6 months. And it's really cool that we're actually checking for the year as well. And with this in place, now let's worry about refactoring this so it matches exactly what the front end is expecting. Okay, and once we have our last 6 months, let's refactor it so it matches exactly what the front end is expecting. And basically, we want to send the very last month as the last item, which is not the case in our setup at the moment. So notice we actually have the last month as the first one. That's why we'll have to run here this reverse. And also I want a little bit different format. That's again what the front end is expecting. And therefore we'll use this package, the moment.js package, where we'll pass in our year and a month, and it will set up a nice format. Basically, the idea is following, where again we have monthly applications. We'll set it equal to a new value that we're getting back from the map. We'll iterate over this array, and then in each object we'll pull out this year, month, as well as the count, and we'll set up a new date, where essentially we'll go with month and then month -1, because for the moment, the library moment.js, it treats months differently than the Mongo. That's why we subtract this one, and then we'll pass in the year, and then we'll format it in such a way. So we'll have that month and then the year. And then as far as what we're returning, we'll return date and count. Those are the two properties that the front end is looking for. And then, like I just mentioned, we'll also set up the reverse, because I want the last month to be displayed as the last item in this chart. And that's why I will need to set this one up as the last item in my array. Hopefully that makes sense. I'll leave the console log just so we can see what is our result. So we'll go with monthly applications. Then again, we'll set it equal to monthly applications.map. We iterate over. In this case, we're returning a object. And then I'll reference each and every object in this case as a item. And I'll just say that I want to pull out this ID. More specifically, I want to pull out the year as well as the month. And that will be equal to the item, of course. Now I also want to grab the count, which is going to be over here. Now that one is not inside of the ID, so make sure that you add it outside of this object. And then let's construct that new date. So we'll go here with date. We have the library, so we'll set it equal to moment. We'll invoke it, and then we can just chain our format. So first, let's set up the month. And like I said, we'll pass in month -1, just because they treat months differently. Then we'll pass in the year, like so. That's our value. And then lastly, we'll run that format. I'll just say that we want to return it in this format. Now, if you want to learn about different formats, please reference their documentation. And then lastly, we just want to return something from the callback function. And we'll just go with new object. So let me go here and let's just say return. And we're looking for date. And we're looking for the count. Again, let's navigate back to the front end here. Let's invoke it. And then if we take a look, this is what we're returning. So we have the last month. And we have 6 basically months over here. And once we have everything in place, we just want to change this around. We're not going to log this. And instead of empty array, we'll send this one back over here. Once we save, once we refresh, if everything is correct, you should see this chart over here. And with this, we're done with the application. We just need to deploy it on Heroku. All right, and the only thing left is the deployment. Now, during the project, I mentioned quite a few times that we'll deploy the project to Heroku, but while I was recording, Heroku stopped supporting the free tier. So just like the previous project, the Jobs API, we're going to deploy this one to Render platform. And let's just start by moving the star to the desktop, since that's my preference. So that's my main repo. I'm looking for Jobs API. I want to grab the star. I'll open up the Visual Studio Code, copy and paste, and we'll start by removing the existing repo. So I want to start from the scratch. So let's go with rm, then rf, and then git. Okay, good. And if we take a look at the README, we can see that we need to remove the proc file. We'll need to set up the package JSON. But before we do any of that, I actually forgot to add one line of code in the controllers. So where we have show stats, I forgot to add the reverse. So let's do that one first. So let me go to controllers, looking for jobs, then stats, and notice over here, the monthly applications, we want to go with dot and reverse. Basically, you just want to add this function. Otherwise, the dates that we're getting back is basically not in order. Then let's take a look at the README again. So that was the code thing. Then we have the proc file. So we'll remove that one. There's no point to have this file if we're not deploying this to Heroku. Then in package.json, we might as well remove the engines. And then the last one is the build one. We need to fix the build folder. So what's the issue? Well, you see, this is a different project, since we also have the front end and it's a React project. So ideally what we want to do, we want to set this whole thing as one repo. So our server as well as our front end. Now all is good, but in the client we have our own git ignore. And in that git ignore, we say which files we don't want to push. And actually, the build folder is one of them. So even though everything works locally, the moment we'll push this whole thing to the GitHub and then deploy it on render, it's not going to work. Why? Because the client is going to be missing. Or I'm sorry, the build is going to be missing. And in order to avoid that, we either remove this rule from git ignore, or more complex one would be setting up the public folder or whatever folder you want here on the server, and then copy and paste the contents of the build one. Now keep in mind one thing though, if you do that, if you do the second option, then you also have to change this logic, because now your front end is going to be in a different place. And therefore, I'm just going to go with the first one, where in the git ignore, I'm going to remove the build one, like so. So now, once we'll set this one up as one repo, everything is going to work as expected, since we have already built out the files again. We're just talking about the GitHub repo, since that's where we get the project for the render one. So it looks like everything's in place, and I can just go with git init. Let me just double check quickly. Yep, set up the new repo, deploy and render. So those were the things that we wanted to fix. So git init, git add, and git commit. Git commit. And I'm going to go with first commit. Then let's go to GitHub. Let's create a new one. I'm going to go again with temp and then Jobster API. So we create the new project. We want to grab these lines of code. Then let's clear everything, copy and paste, and we're good to go. So essentially, if we navigate to the GitHub, we should see all our files, including, very, very important, build one. This is where our production ready application lives. Okay, so now let's go to the render. Let's go with web service. And now notice we have here temp Jobster API, which we created a few seconds ago. So let's connect to this one. I'm going to go with node course Jobster API. So that's going to be my name, root directory, blah, blah, blah. As you can see, pretty much everything stays the same from the previous project. In here, though, I'm going to go with npm install, not yarn, node app.js. Make sure that your file name is not server.js, for example. Then let's keep rolling. And then in advanced, let's try something else. Remember how in the previous project we used add environment variables? In this case, what I want to do is add secret file. So we also have this cool option where instead of copying them one by one, which is definitely an option we covered in the previous project, we can also set up the whole thing. So I can go with add secret file. Then I'm going to go with .env, and then I'll copy in the contents of my .env. Again, we're just speeding this up a little bit. So let me stop the video, let me add all my secret variables, and then we'll continue with deployment. And once we have the secret file in place, let's start the deployment. And just like the previous time, we'll have to wait a little bit. So I'll stop the video and resume once the deployment is done. Okay, and it looks like our deployment was successful. Let me just open up the URL. Yep. If I can see the landing page, that means that everything works as expected. Hopefully everyone enjoyed the project. Hopefully you were able to deploy your project. And I'll see you in the next one.